The Riley Dormitory at our university had always been a place of whispers and quiet conversations about its dreaded third floor. It was a handsome building with its red brick facade and arched windows, standing proud amidst the ancient oaks and manicured lawns. However, despite its welcoming exterior, there was one room that no one dared to occupy, room 309, infamously known as the suicide room. I had always been a skeptic, dismissing the stories as mere campus legends designed to spook freshmen. My name is Alex, and as someone entering the final year of my psychology degree, I prided myself on my rationality and scientific mindset. I believed that any supernatural occurrence could be explained through logic and reason, but the tale of room 309 was a persistent one, recounted with unnerving consistency. The room was said to be cursed. Over the past decade, three students who had lived there had taken their lives within its confines. Each had been a promising scholar, seemingly happy, yet each had left behind notes filled with despair and confusion. The room had remained vacant ever since the last tragedy, but its reputation lingered like a dense fog over the dormitory. I was not initially interested in the room, nor did I have any plans to test its alleged curse. However, as part of a project for my senior thesis, I decided to explore the psychological impact of urban legends on behavior. My advisor suggested a hands-on approach, a practical study that could provide unique insights. That was how, with a mixture of curiosity and intellectual ambition, I found myself requesting to stay in room 309 for a month. The administration was surprisingly amenable, perhaps eager to dispel the building's ominous reputation. The room had been locked since the last incident, but they handed me the key with a look of both relief and concern. I moved in on a crisp autumn afternoon, the air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires. Room 309 appeared perfectly normal at first glance. It was a standard dorm room, perhaps a little larger than most, with a single bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the main quad. The walls were a dull beige, and the floor was covered in a thin gray carpet. There was nothing immediately unsettling about it, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That first night was uneventful. I spent my time unpacking and setting up my laptop, dismissing every creak and groan of the old building as typical noises of a structure settling into the cool night. My focus was on gathering data, journals to record my experiences, video equipment to document any unusual happenings, and audio devices to capture anything that I might miss. I was prepared for every logical outcome, or so I thought. It was on the third night that the first disturbance occurred. I had just settled into bed, the room illuminated by the soft glow of my bedside lamp. As my eyes started to grow heavy, a sudden chill swept across the room, raising goosebumps on my skin. It was as if an icy hand had brushed over me. The lamp flickered and then dimmed, though the bulb was new. I sat up, the rational part of my mind insisting that it was merely a draft or a faulty connection. Then came the whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves in a distant breeze. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a rhythmic cadence to them, a desperate urgency that set my heart racing. I reached for the audio recorder, my hands trembling slightly, and pressed record. For hours, I lay there, listening to the indistinct murmurs until exhaustion finally claimed me. The following morning, I reviewed the recording, hoping to find some logical explanation, but the whispering was undeniably present, a low, continuous hum that defied any logical origin. I consulted with Professor Davis, my advisor, who seemed intrigued yet slightly uneasy about my findings. She urged me to continue, though her usual assuredness was tinged with caution. As the days passed, the disturbances grew more frequent and pronounced. Objects moved from their places when I wasn't looking. My books, my pens, even my laptop once found on the floor despite having been left securely on the desk. Each time, I tried to rationalize the occurrences, reminding myself that our minds often play tricks when we expect to be scared. But then, I began to dream. Vivid, unsettling dreams that left me gasping for air. In them, I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by shadows that twisted and writhed, their whispers now audible and clear. They spoke of despair and loneliness, of promises broken and dreams unfulfilled. They called to me, beckoning with icy fingers, urging me to join them. Waking from these dreams was like breaking through the surface of icy water, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. I found myself dreading the approach of darkness, yet compelled to continue my study. The logical part of me insisted that this was the culmination of stress and suggestion, the very psychological impact I sought to study. But another part of me, one grounded in instinct, began to wonder if there was more to this room than mere legend. One evening, as I sat at my desk, reviewing my notes, the whispers returned with an intensity that was both terrifying and fascinating. They swirled around me, a cacophony of voices that seemed to originate from within the very walls. I could feel their pull, an insidious tug at the fringes of my consciousness, urging surrender. In a moment of desperation, I called out, demanding to know what they wanted. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, as if the room itself held its breath. Then, just as I began to think I had imagined it all, a single word echoed through the stillness. Leave. It was a command, both simple and absolute. The lights flickered wildly, plunging me into a disorienting dance of shadow and light. Panic seized me, and for the first time since arriving, I considered abandoning the project. But my resolve held firm. There was something here, something that defied explanation, and I was determined to understand it. Determined to find some connection, I delved into the histories of the previous occupants. Their stories were tragic, each driven to despair by circumstances that seemed overwhelming yet mundane: academic pressure, failed relationships, isolation. But what was striking was the similarity in their final days. Each had mentioned dreams, whispers in the night, an unseen presence that had slowly consumed their will. I knew I was treading a fine line, skirting the edge of something that could easily become too real. My nights were now battles against an encroaching dread that threatened to overwhelm my senses. The dreams grew darker, the shadows more insistent, until I began to lose track of what was real and what was illusion. It all came to a head one stormy night. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames as rain lashed against the glass like 1,000 tiny hands. The room felt alive, charged with a palpable energy that crackled in the air. I lay awake, the covers pulled up to my chin, my eyes darting around the dimly lit room. Suddenly, the whispers rose to a crescendo, a deafening roar that filled my head with their insistent plea. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was futile. Their words were now clear, each syllable a needle of ice driving into my mind. Join us, Alex. Join us. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing down with an oppressive weight. Heart pounding, I stumbled from the bed, backing away until I was pressed against the door. My hand fumbled for the doorknob, and with a twist, I flung it open and stumbled into the hallway. The corridor was dark, the emergency lights casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I ran, my footsteps echoing like gunshots, until I burst into the stairwell and fled down to the lobby. There, beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, I finally stopped, chest heaving, heart racing. The whispers had ceased, the oppressive weight lifted, but the fear lingered. I knew then that the room held something beyond my understanding, a presence that was both ancient and malevolent. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, but it was real. I left the dormitory that night, abandoning my project with an urgency that left no room for second thoughts. The administration was understanding, their expressions a mixture of concern and reluctant acknowledgement of the room's history. I moved to another dorm across campus, where the air was filled with laughter and the warmth of human presence. Yet, even now, long after those harrowing days, a part of room 309 remains with me. In the stillness of night, when the world is quiet and my thoughts drift unbidden, I sometimes hear the faintest whisper, a reminder of a place that defies reason, where shadows hold stories, and the walls remember. The university dormitory stood like a monolithic structure against the pale sky, its facade both inviting with the promise of new friendships and daunting with the weight of its history. It was a vast building with endless corridors and identical doors, each concealing the lives and secrets of the students within. I was assigned to room 214, a typical double occupancy setup with two small desks, two twin beds, and a shared wardrobe. It was my first time away from home, and my anticipation was overshadowed by a sense of reluctance, though I told myself it was natural. My roommate, Ethan, was already there when I arrived. He was an unassuming figure, with glasses perched on his nose and a quiet air about him. He greeted me with a nod, barely looking up from the thick book he was engrossed in. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, acknowledging the common ground of our studies. Both of us were majoring in psychology. Ethan's side of the room was meticulously organized, every book and piece of clothing perfectly in place. It mirrored a mind disciplined yet possibly overburdened by the need for order. I unpacked my belongings with less precision, feeling his eyes occasionally glance in my direction, though he never engaged in conversation further than necessary. The first few days went by with little incident. We lived in a comfortable silence, respecting each other's space and routines. It wasn't until a week later that I noticed the first disturbance. It was a small thing, a mere blip in the monotony of dorm life, but it was enough to unsettle me. I had returned from a late night study session at the library to find my desk lamp turned on, casting a pool of light across my empty desk. I distinctly remembered turning it off before leaving. Ethan was asleep, his light breathing the only sound in the room. I brushed it off as a lapse in memory, convincing myself that exhaustion was to blame. But then it happened again and again. Not just the lamp, but little things began to shift in my absence. A book that I had left on the desk was now on the bed, my laptop screen left open when I distinctly remembered closing it. Each time, Ethan appeared nonchalant, either absorbed in his studies or asleep, never acknowledging the oddities. His calm demeanor only heightened my unease. It was as if he was aware of the disruptions and chose not to address them, or perhaps he was the orchestrator of these subtle changes. My sleep became restless. I would lie awake, listening to the rhythmic breathing of my roommate, the silence of the dormitory pressing in on me from all sides. The shadows cast by the streetlight outside danced eerily across the walls, mocking my inability to find peace. One night, while tossing and turning, I heard a faint rustling sound. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but the sound persisted, a soft, deliberate movement coming from Ethan's side of the room. I turned slowly, straining my eyes in the dim light. Ethan was sitting upright in his bed, his posture rigid, his eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. It was a sight so jarring that it took me a moment to process. I called his name softly, thinking he might have been sleepwalking or having a night terror. There was no response, but I noticed his lips moving, forming silent words that never reached my ears. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hair on my arms standing on end. The next morning, Ethan behaved as if nothing had happened. He was his usual reserved self, offering a polite nod as he left for his early class. I wanted to confront him about what I had seen, to ask if he was aware or remembered any of it, but my words faltered. There was something unsettling about his calmness, an underlying tension that I couldn't quite place. Instead, I resolved to keep a closer watch, hoping to uncover the mystery of my roommate's nocturnal behavior. Over the next few weeks, the occurrences became more frequent, more unnerving. I found my belongings rearranged almost daily. The lamp, the books, even my shoes would be placed in different spots. Each new disruption pulled me further into a vortex of anxiety. I became hyper aware, my senses heightened, constantly on edge. Ethan's nightly episodes continued, his silent recitations growing in intensity. I began to document the disturbances, keeping a journal of each strange event, hoping to find a pattern or meaning. One night, I decided to film Ethan, a desperate attempt to capture the inexplicable. I set up my phone discreetly, ensuring it would record without his knowledge. As night fell and the dormitory settled into its usual quiet, I lay awake, waiting. The rustling began as expected, and I watched as Ethan sat up, his eyes glazed over, his lips moving in that silent prayer. I felt a sick fascination mixed with fear as I observed through the camera lens. the dim light of the street lamp illuminating his features in stark contrast. The footage was unsettling, confirming what I had witnessed each night. But as I reviewed the recording the following day, I noticed something even more chilling. In the background, faintly visible, was a shadow moving behind Ethan, an amorphous figure barely perceptible in the low light. It drifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. My heart pounded in my chest, the implications of what I had captured crashing over me like a wave. Was this the source of the disturbances? Or was it something feeding off Ethan's strange ritual? I was not prepared to confront him directly, fearing his reaction or the possibility of driving whatever force inhabited our room into a more malevolent state. Instead, I took to the library, diving into research about sleep disorders, paranormal occurrences, anything that might offer an explanation. My studies were consumed with theories and myths, the line between reality and fiction blurring as my exhaustion deepened. I found accounts of sleep paralysis, night terrors, but nothing that perfectly matched what I was experiencing. The climax came one stormy night, the wind howling outside like a feral beast. I lay in bed, the weight of my own fear pressing down on me. Ethan had fallen asleep quickly, his breathing deep and even. I felt the familiar tension rising within me, a precursor to the nightly ritual. But this time, something was different. The air felt charged, heavy with a foreboding energy. I sensed a presence, an oppressive force that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. Ethan sat up, his movements more abrupt than before. His eyes, usually devoid of awareness during these episodes, were wide with terror, darting around the room as if seeing something I couldn't. He began to speak, his voice low and tremulous, the first sound I had heard from him during these nocturnal moments. "It's here," he whispered, the words barely audible over the storm. "It's always been here." The room felt like it had contracted, the walls closing in. I struggled to breathe, the air thick and unyielding. The shadow moved again, more pronounced, creeping along the periphery of the room. I felt a primal fear, an instinct to flee, but my body was frozen, rooted to the spot by a force beyond comprehension. Ethan's voice rose, a tremor of panic evident. "You can't hide. It knows. It sees everything." His words were a crescendo of despair, his eyes now fixed on me, pleading. At that moment, I understood that whatever haunted our room was not just a figment of his troubled mind, but a reality we both had to face. The lights flickered, casting the room into a dizzying cycle of light and dark. The shadows seemed to pulse with each flicker, growing larger, more defined. It loomed over Ethan, twisting and writhing like a serpent poised to strike. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound escaped my lips. In the chaos, Ethan collapsed back onto his bed, the shadow dissipating into the corners of the room as if retreating to await the next opportunity. Morning broke with an uneasy calm. Ethan was gone, his belongings packed and his side of the room vacant. There was no note, no explanation, only the lingering presence of what had transpired. I was left alone in room 214, the secrets of my roommate and the entity that shadowed him an enigma that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Despite his absence, the disturbances continued, albeit with less frequency. The shadow no longer appeared, but the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, persisted. I took to leaving the lights on at night, my sleep a restless cycle of waking and drifting. The university offered to relocate me, but I declined, tethered by an unspoken bond to the space that had become both a sanctuary and a prison. Even as the semester ended and I packed my things to leave, the memory of those nights lingered. The room, now stripped bare, seemed to sigh with relief, its secrets once more concealed behind the door marked 214. I walked away, the cool breeze of freedom mingling with the haunting whisper of mystery unsolved. Years later, the experience remains vivid in my mind, a chapter of my life shrouded in mystery and fear. I often reflect on Ethan, wondering where he went, whether he found peace or was consumed by the shadows that stalked him. The lessons I learned about the human psyche, the fragility of perception, and the thin veil between reality and the supernatural have stayed with me, guiding my path as a psychologist and a seeker of the unknown. The dormitory still stands, a monolith of tales untold, its corridors echoing with the whispers of those who came before and those yet to come. When I first moved into the apartment on the 14th floor of the towering city block, it was midsummer, and the city below shimmered in the oppressive heat. My new home was a modest one-bedroom affair, a perfect fit for someone like me who had never been keen on excess or clutter. The rent was surprisingly low for such a central location, but I didn't question it, perhaps because I was desperate for a new start. The building itself was an unremarkable slab of concrete, typical of urban architecture from the late 80s, with narrow corridors and the faint scent of stale air that seemed to permanently linger. Yet, there was a kind of comfort in its anonymity. From my window, I had a view of the city skyline, a jagged silhouette that held promise and anonymity all at once. The apartment was bare, save for the essentials left behind by the previous tenant, a few pieces of outdated furniture, and, as I would soon discover, a stained envelope taped to the underside of a kitchen drawer. I found the note on my second night. I was organizing the kitchen, trying to impose some sense of order on the chaos of unpacked boxes. I had reached into one of the drawers for a stray spoon when my fingers brushed against paper. My curiosity piqued. I pulled out the envelope. It was old and yellowed, the kind that made you think of forgotten love letters or unsent invitations to long-past events. My name was scrawled on the front, though I had no idea how the previous tenant had known it. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, I found a handwritten note. To whoever finds this, beware. There are things in this apartment that do not wish to be seen. They hide in shadows and feed on fear. Trust your instincts. If you feel watched, you are. If you hear whispers, they are speaking to you. Leave before it's too late. I read the note several times, each reading sinking a little deeper into my psyche. At first, it was a source of mild amusement. Clearly, the previous occupant had been prone to flights of fancy. Yet, as I sat in the quiet of my new living room, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling that settled over me like a chill. The room seemed darker, the shadows longer and more sinister than they had any right to be. I laughed it off, attributing my nerves to the stress of moving and the unfamiliarity of my surroundings. But as the days passed, the sense of being watched became harder to ignore. At odd moments, I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, blurs that vanished when focused on. Nighttime was worse. The apartment took on an oppressive weight, an almost suffocating closeness. I would lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They were just below the threshold of comprehension, a constant susurration that filled my ears and left me restless and uneasy. I tried to dismiss these occurrences as my imagination playing tricks on me, the remnants of the note's influence exerting pressure on my subconscious. Yet, every night, the whispers persisted, their tones seemingly more urgent with each passing hour. My sleep was fitful, plagued by dreams where faceless figures watched from darkened corners, their eyes glinting with malice. By the third week, the disturbances had escalated. My belongings would shift inexplicably. A book I knew I placed on the coffee table would later be found on the kitchen counter. Lights would flicker ominously as I entered a room, and I often felt an icy draft, despite the windows being tightly shut. I began to wonder if perhaps there was some truth to the warning in the note. Desperate for reassurance, I confided in my neighbor, an elderly woman who lived across the hall. She listened with a grave expression, nodding slowly as I recounted my experiences. "You're not the first, you know," she said in a voice that was little more than a whisper. "That apartment, it has a history. Tenants come and go. No one stays long. It's as if the place itself wants to be left alone." Her words did nothing to calm my nerves. If anything, they amplified the unease that had become my constant companion. I began to dread returning to the apartment after work, hesitating at the door before entering, bracing myself for whatever malevolent presence awaited me. The note's warning played in my mind in an endless loop, a sinister mantra I couldn't escape. One particularly oppressive night, unable to endure the whispers any longer, I resolved to confront whatever had taken up residence in my home. I armed myself with a flashlight and began a methodical search of the apartment, moving through each room in turn. The shadows seemed to thicken as I moved, shapes shifting just beyond the reach of the light. It was in the bedroom closet that I found something concrete, something that made my blood run cold. Pushed to the back, hidden beneath a pile of dusty old clothes, was a small wooden box. Its surface was intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Inside, I found photographs, black and white, old and creased. Each photo depicted a different person, all of them standing in the very rooms I now called home, their expressions vacant and eyes unnaturally dark. The revelation was too much to bear. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Those eyes, those empty, void-like eyes, seemed to bore into my soul, conveying a silent message of despair and inevitability. I dropped the box, its contents spilling across the floor, and fled from the room, my breath ragged and heart pounding in my chest. I called my sister, my voice trembling as I explained what I had found. She insisted I come stay with her, at least for a few days, to clear my head and gain some distance from whatever was happening in the apartment. I agreed, packing a small bag with shaking hands, casting nervous glances over my shoulder as if expecting to see one of those spectral figures watching me. As I locked the door behind me, I heard it, a clear, unmistakable whisper, louder than it had ever been before. Stay, it urged, the words stretching out, echoing in the empty hallway. I didn't look back, forcing myself to move towards the elevator, towards the promise of safety and sanity. That night, as I lay on my sister's couch, I felt a semblance of calm return. The distance from the apartment, from its oppressive atmosphere, was a balm to my frayed nerves. Yet, as sleep began to take hold, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. In my dreams, the photographs returned, those hollow eyes haunting me, and I awoke with a start, the shadows in the room seeming to pulse with life. I spent a week with my sister, weighing my options. I could not return to the apartment, not with the knowledge of what I had uncovered. Yet the thought of leaving it unresolved held a strange magnetism. Part of me was drawn to the mystery, to the dark history that seemed interwoven with the very fabric of the place. When I finally returned, it was with a sense of resignation and determination. If I was to live there, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I spent hours researching the building, combing through old archives and newspaper clippings. The history was as unsettling as the experience itself. A series of unexplained tragedies had occurred over the years, deaths, disappearances, all linked to my apartment. Armed with this knowledge, I sought out help from a local historian who had a reputation for delving into the city's darker secrets. He was a tall man with an air of quiet authority, and as I recounted my story, he listened intently, nodding as if everything I described was expected. The building was constructed on the site of an old asylum, he explained. There were rumors of experiments, unethical practices. It said the spirits of those who suffered linger, bound to the place by their anguish. His words filled me with a cold dread, yet there was also a strange comfort in hearing my experiences validated. We discussed the possibility of a cleansing, a ritual to appease the lingering spirits and restore peace to the apartment. That night, as I prepared for the ritual, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. It felt as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting. I followed the historian's instructions meticulously, lighting candles and speaking words meant to guide the spirits to rest. For a moment, there was silence, a profound stillness that filled the room. And then, slowly, the whispers began to fade, the oppressive weight lifting. I dared to hope that perhaps, finally, I could make this place my home. Weeks passed, and the disturbances ceased. I found a new rhythm, a sense of normalcy returning to my life. Yet, the memory of those eyes, of the photographs and the note's dire warning, never fully left me. They lingered in the back of my mind, a reminder of the unseen world that brushed against ours, of the thin veil separating the living from the lost. Even now, as I sit in the quiet of my apartment, with the city sprawling out below me, I can't help but glance at the shadows, half expecting them to twitch and dance in the periphery of my vision. The fear lingers, a ghost of its own, a testament to the mysteries that dwell in places we think we know. And perhaps that is the true horror, to be forever haunted not by what we have seen, but by what lies just beyond the edge of understanding. When I first moved into the apartment, it seemed like any other modest abode nestled within the city's bustling heart. The building itself was unassuming, one of those older brick constructs with a character that spoke of countless lives lived within its walls. My unit was on the third floor, an airy one-bedroom flat with large windows that overlooked the street. I felt a sense of comfort in its worn wooden floors, the slightly yellowed walls, and the tiny kitchen that promised cozy meals. It was, in all respects, a normal place for a new beginning. My previous apartment had been too cramped and far from work. This one promised a fresh start, a convenient location, and a surprisingly reasonable rent. The landlord, a man named Mr. Hargrove, seemed pleasant enough, although his eyes held a strange sadness when he showed me the place. He mentioned only briefly some renovation work had been done after the last tenant left abruptly. I didn't pry. Everyone had their reasons, and I was just glad to have found a suitable home. The first few weeks passed by uneventfully. I settled into a routine of sorts, balancing work deadlines with attempts to furnish the apartment sparsely yet tastefully. Occasionally, I chatted with neighbors in the corridors or the small communal garden at the back of the building. Life took on a gentle rhythm that was both reassuring and predictable. One evening, as I returned home late from work, I noticed something odd. The hallway light flickered as I approached my door. Flickering lights were not uncommon in old buildings, but this one seemed to pulse in a rhythmic pattern, as if communicating some silent message. Shrugging it off, I unlocked my door and stepped inside, eager to collapse on the couch and unwind. The moment I entered, a cold draft swept through the apartment, chilling me to the bone. I checked the windows. They were all shut tight. I dismissed it as a fluke of old building insulation and turned my attention to preparing dinner. As I cooked, I felt a peculiar sensation, like being watched. The hairs on my neck prickled with an awareness I couldn't shake. I glanced around, but nothing seemed amiss. The sensation lingered, a shadow unbidden in the corners of my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, the shadow seemed to stretch and contort across the walls. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sensation of something shifting in the periphery of my vision. I woke several times, heart pounding, eyes straining to discern any movement in the darkness. Each time, I found nothing but the benign shapes of furniture looming in the night. Over the next few days, the sense of being watched grew more palpable. While working on my laptop, the cursor would occasionally move erratically, selecting text or opening files I hadn't touched. The apartment, once comforting, now felt charged with an electric undercurrent, unsettling in its intensity. My dreams turned vivid and bizarre, filled with hazy figures whispering just out of earshot, their faces blurred and shifting like smoke. I confided in a neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Collins, during one of our chance meetings in the garden. Her eyes widened slightly when I mentioned the disturbances. She hesitated, then leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're in number 307, aren't you?" she asked, her gaze intent. I nodded, curiosity piqued. "They say that place is touched," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "The last tenant, a young man, left in quite a hurry. Never said why, but he looked haunted, if you catch my meaning." Her words lingered with me long after our conversation ended. I decided to do some investigating, not entirely sure what I was looking for. The building's records were sparse, but I managed to track down a few details about the previous tenant. His name was Daniel, a quiet individual who'd kept mostly to himself. No one seemed to know why he left or where he went. As I dug deeper, the disturbances in my apartment grew bolder. One evening, as I sat reading, the lights dimmed, then flared brightly before settling into a sullen glow. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath misting in the suddenly cold air. It felt as though the apartment itself was alive and aware, reacting to my every move. The whispers in my dreams grew louder, more insistent, like a cacophony of voices all vying for my attention. In desperation, I contacted Mr. Hargrove, hoping for some insight. He seemed reluctant to speak over the phone, but agreed to meet in person. When he arrived, he looked more harried than I remembered, as if he too carried the weight of some unseen burden. "There's something you should know," he began, his voice slow and hesitant. "Daniel, the last tenant, he was involved in something. He never said much, but there were rumors. Strange things happened when he was around." "What sort of strange things?" I pressed, eager for any piece of the puzzle. "Objects moving on their own, odd noises, shadows where there shouldn't be any," he replied. "Some said he was dabbling in things better left alone." I listened, each word adding to the tapestry of unease that quilted my mind. Mr. Hargrove left soon after, offering little more than an apologetic glance over his shoulder. Alone once more, I contemplated my next move. The following night, I awoke to the sound of something scraping against the floorboards. Disoriented and fearful, I fumbled for the light switch. The room was empty, but there were marks on the floor, as if heavy furniture had been dragged across it. I could no longer deny the presence of an otherworldly force, a remnant of whatever Daniel had unleashed. Determined to confront whatever lurked within my home, I spent the following day researching protection rituals and wards. I gathered salt, sage, and candles, preparing to cleanse the apartment. As night fell, I steeled myself, beginning the ritual with a mixture of fear and resolve. The air crackled with tension as I moved through the rooms, murmuring incantations and scattering salt in doorways and corners. The shadows seemed to vibrate, the apartment shuddering as if in protest. The whispers filled my ears, rising to a fevered pitch, their words unintelligible, yet deeply unsettling. In the midst of the ritual, a figure materialized in the living room. It was indistinct, a silhouette of swirling shadows and flickering lights. I felt its gaze on me, heavy and oppressive, as if it were measuring my worth. A chill swept through the room, the air thick with a sense of malevolence. Summoning all my courage, I continued the ritual, my voice firm despite the trembling of my hands. The figure wavered, its form shifting and blurring. For a moment, I glimpsed a face within the shadows, eyes filled with anguish and despair. It was Daniel's visage, twisted in a silent scream. A final, desperate incantation tore from my lips, filling the space with a resonant power. The figure recoiled, the shadows unraveling as if caught in a powerful wind. With a soundless cry, it dissipated, leaving only silence in its wake. The apartment exhaled, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like a dissipating storm. Exhausted, I sank to the floor, heart racing with the adrenaline of the encounter. The whispers were gone, the shadows returned to their natural forms, and the air felt lighter, free of the oppressive weight that had lingered for so long. In the days that followed, the apartment returned to a state of normalcy. I found a strange peace in the aftermath of the confrontation, as if I had reclaimed my territory from an unseen invader. Yet, a lingering fear remained, a small, persistent doubt that whispered in the quiet corners of my mind. What had I truly encountered that night? Was it a manifestation of Daniel's fears, a remnant of his dealings with forces unknown, or something deeper, an entity that had found fertile ground in his despair and loneliness? These questions echoed in my thoughts, unanswered and unsettling. Despite the normalcy that settled over my life, I knew the apartment held secrets I might never fully understand. In the quiet moments, when the light slanted through the windows just so, casting long shadows across the floor, I felt a twinge of unease, a reminder of the apartment's otherworldly dangers, a silent testament to the fragile boundary between our world and whatever lay beyond. Even now, as I write these words, a chill runs down my spine, and I can't shake the feeling that I am not alone. The apartment, for all its outward simplicity, harbors depths I dare not plumb. It is a place of secrets and shadows, where the past whispers to the present, and the boundaries of reality waver like the flickering light in the hallway. And so, I remain, a tenant of both the mundane and the mysterious, my life entwined with the echoes of those who came before me. In the heart of the city, in the quiet of my apartment, I exist in a delicate balance, ever aware that the ordinary can mask the extraordinary, and that safety is often an illusion as tenuous as the flickering light above my door. In the heart of the city, nestled among the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, stood an old building, an architectural relic from a time long past. Its facade was an intricate dance of faded stonework and iron balconies, each telling stories of a bygone era. This was where I found my new apartment, a place I hoped would offer solace from the relentless pace of city life. As I walked through the grand entrance for the first time, a sense of calm washed over me, as though the building itself had taken me into its care. The apartment was on the fifth floor. Its high ceilings and large windows filled the space with a dignified charm that the sterile, modern apartments lacked. The hardwood floors creaked with a comforting familiarity, and the walls, though faded, held an elegance that time had not erased. As I moved my belongings in, I felt a peculiar attachment to the place, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The old lady in the apartment next door was the first to welcome me. Her name was Mrs. Hargrove, a sprightly woman with silver hair and a sharp wit. She told me about the building's history over tea, her stories weaving a tapestry of intrigue and mystery. According to her, the building had once been a grand hotel, hosting luminaries and dignitaries before it was converted into apartments. Her voice lowered as she spoke of the rumored hauntings, tales of spirits lingering in the shadows, their whispers carried on the wind through the narrow hallways. At first, I dismissed these tales as mere folklore, remnants of an old woman's imagination, but as days turned into weeks, I began noticing the peculiarities. It was subtle at first, the sensation of being watched, the soft whispers just out of earshot, the inexplicable chill that would seep into the room despite the warmth outside. I attributed these to the building's age, its creaks and groans simply settling noises, nothing more. Then, one evening as I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, immersed in a novel, there came a distinct tapping from behind the walls. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as if seeking attention. I paused, waiting for it to stop, attributing it to the pipes or perhaps an industrious rodent. But as the sound persisted, my curiosity got the better of me. I rose, moving closer to the wall, pressing my ear against it. The tapping ceased, replaced by a hushed whisper. I strained to hear, but the words eluded me, fading into the silence. As I pulled back, the air felt heavier, charged with an indescribable tension. I shook it off as a trick of my mind, returning to my book, though it now seemed impossible to concentrate. The rest of the evening passed without incident, yet the unease lingered, a shadow cast over my thoughts. The following days were uneventful, a return to normalcy that lulled me into a false sense of security. I threw myself into work, using the city's chaos as a distraction. It was not until the next weekend, when I decided to spend a quiet evening at home, that the disturbances resumed. This time, it was not a tapping, but a soft, mournful melody, a tune that seemed to seep through the walls, enveloping the room. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet unbearably sad, as if mourning something lost. I searched for the source, moving from room to room, but the music seemed to travel with me, never louder, never softer, always present. My heart raced, caught between the beauty of the sound and the fear of the unknown. I had never heard anything like it, and the possibility of it being a neighbor's radio seemed increasingly unlikely. The melody continued for hours, until exhaustion overcame my fear and I fell into a restless sleep. My dreams that night were vivid, filled with faceless figures and shadowy corridors. I wandered through the building, each door hiding secrets I could not fathom, each turn bringing me closer to a truth that slithered just out of reach. I awoke in a cold sweat, the morning light doing little to banish the night specters. Determined to understand what was happening, I sought out Mrs. Hargrove. She listened with an empathetic ear, nodding knowingly. "It's not uncommon," she said with a sigh. "This building has history, dear. Some of it chooses to linger." Her words offered little comfort, yet her presence was reassuring. She suggested I speak with Mr. Delaney, the building's superintendent, who had been around the longest. Mr. Delaney was a reclusive man, but after some persuasion, he agreed to meet. We sat in his cluttered office, the air thick with dust and the scent of old paper. He was a man of few words, his eyes shadowed with secrets he did not wish to share. When I recounted my experiences, He simply nodded, as if confirming something he had always known. This building, he paused, choosing his words carefully. It has a way of holding on to things, people, memories. Sometimes they don't move on as they should. I pressed for more, but he remained tight-lipped, advising only that I should not disturb whatever resided within the walls. I left the office more perplexed than before, a knot of anxiety coiling in my stomach. That night, as the city hummed with life below, I sat in silence, waiting for the familiar disturbances. They did not come, but the air felt charged, as if holding its breath, waiting. I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone, that something watched with unseen eyes. As weeks passed, the disturbances grew more pronounced. The tapping, the whispers, the music, they became a part of my nightly routine, each occurrence more unsettling than the last. My mind, once dismissive, now teetered on the edge of belief and doubt. I felt drawn to the walls, their secrets tantalizingly close yet maddeningly hidden. One evening, as I prepared for bed, a new sound emerged from the walls. It was a soft scratching, like nails dragging across wood, growing more frantic with each passing moment. I froze, heart pounding, as the sound moved from room to room, insistent and demanding. Panic surged through me, urging me to flee, but an inexplicable compulsion rooted me to the spot. In a moment of irrationality, I called out, my voice trembling, asking the unseen presence what it wanted. The scratching stopped, replaced by a profound silence that pressed upon me from all sides. I stood there, breathless, as the air around me seemed to shift, a spectral weight lifting in response to my acknowledgement. The following nights were quiet, the disturbances ceasing as abruptly as they had begun. Yet, the absence of sound was not a relief. It was a void, a silence pregnant with anticipation. I moved through my days in a haze, my mind consumed by the mystery that lurked within the walls. Driven by desperation, I began researching the building's history, combing through archives and old newspapers. I discovered a tragic story, one that Mrs. Hargrove had not mentioned. Decades ago, during its time as a hotel, a young musician had lived and died there under mysterious circumstances. Her death was ruled a suicide, but rumors persisted of foul play, whispers of a lost symphony she had been composing. The pieces began to fit together, the melody that haunted my nights, the tapping like a metronome, the scratches like a desperate plea. I felt an overwhelming urge to finish what she had started, to give voice to the music trapped within the walls. I spent nights at the piano, attempting to transcribe the melody from memory, each note an echo of her unfulfilled promise. As I played, the air seemed to hum with energy, the walls vibrating with approval. I could feel her presence, a guiding hand shaping the music, shaping my thoughts. The more I played, the more I felt connected to her, our spirits entwined in a shared purpose. The climax came unexpectedly. One night, as the final notes fell from my fingers, the room was filled with a palpable warmth, as if the very fabric of the air had changed. I felt her gratitude, a serene acceptance that washed over me, and for the first time, the apartment felt truly at peace. In that moment, I understood that I had become a part of the building's history, my actions a bridge between the past and present. The disturbances ceased entirely, leaving behind a silence that was comforting rather than ominous. Yet, the lingering fear remained, a fear not of the supernatural, but of the unknown, of what other secrets might lie hidden within these walls. I still live in that apartment. The echoes of its past now are familiar comfort rather than a source of dread. The city outside continues its relentless rhythm, but within these walls, I have found a sanctuary, a place where time seems to hold its breath. And though the fears have subsided, I know that I am but a caretaker, preserving the stories etched into the very bones of this building. The old downtown building stood as a remnant of the past, its facade weathered by decades of urban life that surged and ebbed like the tides of a restless sea. There was a certain dignity to its worn bricks and faded signage, the kind that spoke of a time when craftsmanship was as much about beauty as it was about function. I had walked by this edifice countless times, always with a fleeting curiosity about what stories it held within its walls. For months, I had scoured the city for an affordable apartment close to my new job, and, by some stroke of serendipity, a vacancy had appeared in that very building. The day I moved in was unremarkable, save for the quiet satisfaction of having finally found a place to call my own. The apartment was small but sufficient for my needs: a living room with a modest kitchen nook, a bedroom just large enough for a full-size bed, and a bathroom whose plumbing, the landlord assured me, was reliable. The windows offered a view of the bustling street below, their panes casting fractured sunlight onto the hardwood floor that creaked softly underfoot. It seemed a peaceful enough place, a sanctuary from the chaos of city life. For the first few nights, I slept soundly, lulled by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional murmur of voices drifting up from the street. My days were filled with the familiar rhythm of work and the quiet solitude of evenings spent reading or listening to music. There was a peculiar comfort in the routine, a sense of balance that I had long sought but rarely found. It was precisely on the seventh night that the first disturbance occurred. I awoke to the muffled sound of knocking, soft yet insistent, as though someone was at the door. I sat up in bed, the clock on the nightstand flashing 3:17 a.m. in dull red numbers. The knocking continued, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the building. Groggy and disoriented, I convinced myself it was simply a quirk of the old structure, pipes contracting, perhaps, or the nocturnal wanderings of another tenant. I dismissed it as such and fell back into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I mentioned the knocking to my neighbor, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Hargrave, whom I often met in the hallway. She smiled with a knowing expression and said, "Ah, the building has its secrets, dear. It's been here longer than most of us. You'll get used to its noises." Her words lingered with me, a cryptic reassurance that did little to quell my curiosity. Over the following nights, the knocking continued, always at precisely 3:17 a.m., unfaltering in its eerie consistency. I began to dread the approach of that hour, knowing with a certainty that defied logic that the sound would inevitably come. It was as if the building itself was trying to tell me something, a message encoded in the rhythm of those ghostly taps. As the days went on, my curiosity grew into an obsession. I found myself poring over old records, trying to uncover the history of the building. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. Constructed in the early 1900s, it had once been a hotel, a grand establishment in its heyday, before falling into disrepair and eventually being converted into apartments. There were whispers of a tragedy that had occurred here, though the specifics were lost to time. Driven by an inexplicable compulsion, I began to explore the building, searching for the source of the knocking. Late at night, when the world outside seemed to hold its breath, I would wander the dimly lit halls, listening, waiting. It was during one of these nocturnal excursions that I stumbled upon a door I had not noticed before, hidden at the end of a seldom used corridor on the third floor. The door was unremarkable, painted the same muted color as the walls, its handle tarnished by age. Yet there was something unsettling about it, an air of neglect that set it apart from the rest. It was locked, of course, and my attempts to force it open proved futile. But I returned night after night, drawn to it by a force I couldn't name, convinced that beyond it lay the answer to the knocking. And then one night, I found the door ajar. My heart raced as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Beyond lay a narrow staircase, descending steeply into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct urging me to turn back, yet the compulsion to proceed was overwhelming. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, the stale air wrapping around me like a shroud as I descended into the unknown. The staircase led to a small, windowless room, its walls lined with yellowed wallpaper that peeled in long strips. A single, dust-covered bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a feeble glow that barely illuminated the space. In the center of the room stood an antique writing desk, its surface cluttered with faded papers and a tarnished inkwell. I approached the desk cautiously, sifting through the papers with trembling hands. They were letters, dated decades ago, written in a careful, looping script. As I read, a chilling story unfolded. Love letters from a woman to a man who had once lived in the building, filled with longing and despair, recounting their clandestine meetings, and the eventual heartbreak of their separation. It was the last letter that caught my breath, a desperate plea, written the night before her lover vanished without a trace. She spoke of the knocks, the same I had heard, of how they haunted her, a harbinger of his departure. Her words were suffused with a sorrow so profound it seemed to echo across the years, resonating within me as if it were my own. I spent hours in that hidden room, piecing together their story, feeling an inexplicable kinship with these souls who had been entwined by fate and circumstance. Yet as dawn approached, I knew I needed to leave, to return to the surface world and the semblance of normalcy it offered. The following nights were plagued by restlessness, the knocking now accompanied by whispers just beyond the threshold of comprehension. They seemed to form words, fragments of sentences, urging me to return to the room below. Despite my growing fear, I found myself drawn back, night after night, descending those stairs into the depths of the building. Each visit brought new revelations, a photograph tucked between the pages of an old book, a ring hidden in a drawer, tangible links to a past that refused to be silenced. The knocking persisted, a relentless rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the beating of my heart, driving me to the brink of madness. The climax came on a stormy night, the wind howling through the city's canyons, thunder rumbling like the roar of some ancient beast. I had fallen into a restless sleep when the knocking began, more insistent than ever before. As I lay there, paralyzed by fear, the whispers grew louder, forming a chorus that beckoned me to the hidden room. Compelled by a force beyond reason, I rose and made my way down the familiar path, the building seeming to shift and breathe around me as I descended the staircase. The room was unchanged, yet the air was charged with a palpable energy, a sense of impending revelation that set my nerves on edge. The letters lay strewn across the desk, as if awaiting my return. I picked them up, reading them once more, the words resonating with a newfound urgency. As I reached the final letter, the whispers crescendoed, the knocking echoing in time, a symphony of despair that seemed to fill the very marrow of my bones. It was then that I saw him, a figure, barely perceptible, standing in the shadows at the far corner of the room. My heart lurched in my chest, yet I felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of recognition. He was waiting, as he had always been, bound to this place by a love that defied the boundaries of life and death. In that moment, I understood. The knocking, the whispers, they were a call to me, a plea for closure, for release. I approached the figure, my movements slow and deliberate, the weight of the past pressing down upon me like a shroud. As I reached the desk, the air seemed to still, the whispers fading into silence. I placed the letters upon the desk with trembling hands, a gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding. And then, as if in response, the figure began to dissolve, the shadows receding to reveal a man, his face gentle and sorrowful, etched with the lines of a life cut short. He gazed at me with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of eternity, and in that gaze, I felt a connection that transcended time and space. The knocking ceased, the silence profound and absolute. I stood there, enveloped in a sense of peace, of release, as if a burden had been lifted from my soul. The figure smiled, a soft, wistful smile, and then he was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of his presence behind. I lingered in the room for a while longer, the echoes of the past slowly fading into the recesses of memory. As I ascended the staircase, the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the door, illuminating the path ahead. I knew that the building, with its secrets and its sorrows, had become a part of me, a chapter in the story of my life. Yet even now, as I write these words, I cannot shake the lingering fear that pervades my thoughts. The knocking has ceased, but the whispers remain, a constant undercurrent to my days, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. I find myself listening for them, straining to catch their elusive words, wondering if they hold some final truth that eludes my understanding. And so I wait, as he once did, suspended between worlds, caught in the web of a mystery that may never be fully unraveled. The apartment remains my sanctuary, its walls a refuge from the outside world, yet also a reminder of the hidden depths that dwell within us all, the secrets that we carry, and the echoes of a past that continue to shape our present.